Hello, in this video we will be talking about landscape photography with an ultra-wide-angle lens, and I will share my experience with Samyang 14mm f2.8 Nikon mount autofocus prime lens. In this video we will learn about 5 key things that you must remember while shooting landscape with an ultra-wide-angle lens. Field of view, perspective, composition, creating depth with lines, patterns and textures, dynamic balance using shape and lines. Before we go further, I would like to thank Samyang Optics for lending me 14mm f2.8 lens to try out, which I enjoyed using during my recent trip to Ladakh in India. Samyang is a Korea-based company which has more than 40 years of experience in making great prime lenses. Recently, they have launched many prime lenses for Sony mirrorless cameras in addition to their existing lineup of DSLR, Nikon and Canon mount lenses. If you are a Canon shooter and into wide-angle photography, then Samyang has a 10mm f3.5 prime lens for you, which is the world's widest distortion-free full-frame lens. If you're looking for a high-quality prime lens, don't forget to check them out. Alright, let's dive in. Field of view. It is the largest area that your lens allows your camera to capture, from left to right and from top to bottom. Field of view depends on your size of the camera sensor and focal length of your lens. Full-frame cameras have larger sensors which allow your camera to capture larger field of view with the same lens. A full-frame camera sensor has 1.5 times bigger sensor than a crop sensor camera. That is why a 14mm lens captures about 110 degrees of field of view, while compared to only 80-degree field of view on an APS-C crop sensor camera. In this image, you can see how a crop sensor camera has a smaller frame than the full-frame camera. In this image, you can see how different focal lengths produce different fields of view. Next important thing is perspective. Perspective is the spatial relationship between different elements in a photograph. Ultra-wide-angle lenses have this peculiar characteristic that they exaggerate the apparent distance between different objects in the photo. Wide-angle lenses also exaggerate the size of the objects in your photo. Objects which are nearer to the lens appear bigger than the objects that are farther away from the lens. They appear smaller. Due to this, a special perspective lines are formed which help you create leading lines and that add depth to your pictures. Let me show you in this illustration how this size variance creates depth in your images. Our next key point is composition with an ultra-wide-angle lens. Composition is, simply put, arrangement of different elements in your frame. When shooting with an ultra-wide-angle lens, just a few steps towards the subject or just a few steps backwards away from the subject will completely change the composition. For example, let me show you these two images. Rule of third is a very common rule for composition. As per this rule, your frame is divided into 3 horizontal parts and 3 vertical parts. For landscape photography, the 3 horizontal parts are very important. The lowest part is known as foreground, The middle part is known as middle ground, and the topmost part is known as the background. It is very important to arrange your elements very carefully in each of these parts of your image. This adds depth to your photograph. Now, since wide-angle lenses have this characteristic that they exaggerate the objects which are closest to the camera, and their size looks bigger than the objects that are farther away from the camera. So your foreground will look exaggerated with an ultra-wide-angle lens. So it's very important to fill your foreground with interesting objects. Now, your subject may not necessarily need to be in the foreground. You may place your subject in the middle ground or in the background, but be careful that each part has to be filled in properly. Another characteristic of ultra-wide-angle lenses is pincushion distortion. Yes, you heard it right. It's distortion, but it can be creatively used to lead the viewer's eye towards the point of interest. What it does is that towards the corners of your frame, whatever objects are there, they seem to be distorted. So the lines which are towards the corners of the frame appear to be bigger, and lines which are away from the corners appear to be smaller or about the same size. A creative use of this particular feature you can see in this image. You can see that the clouds are appearing to converge at the central point. This is happening because of the pincushion distortion. Now, Samyang 14mm f2.8 lens is a very good lens. You can see it's sharp edge to edge and there's barely any distortion. But the pincushion distortion cannot be nil in any ultra-wide-angle lens. It will be there, but it can be creatively used for your advantage. Next thing that we are going to talk about is creating depth with texture and patterns. Texture and patterns are very helpful in creating depth in your image. While this is true for any focal length, with ultra-wide-angle lenses this effect becomes more prominent. Texture or pattern which is closer to the camera appear bigger, and it diminishes as the distance increases from the camera. This leads the viewer's eye into the frame and creates interest. Elements like cobbled streets, pebbles, grass, any other kind of texture works really well to create depth in your images. For example, in these images you can see how the texture and pattern is used to create depth. Our last and final topic is creating dynamic balance with shapes and lines. Dynamic balance is a broad topic, so I'll try to keep it as brief as possible and yet as meaningful. In composition, there are two types of balance. One is dynamic balance and one is static balance. A static balance usually means that the image is very still and gives a sense of calmness, while a dynamic balance gives a sense of urgency, and a viewer, in a dynamically balanced image, a viewer tends to anticipate motion or some sort of change. This creates interest. There are different kinds of lines, and each has its own meaning. Let's take a look at different kinds of lines. A horizontal line. A horizontal line means stillness and calmness. It is the most stable kind of line. Our brains perceive visual cues as to be under the influence of forces of nature, such as gravity and wind and other forces. A vertical line is perceived to be balanced under the influence of wind or other horizontal forces, which means it can easily tip over. Diagonal line is the most unstable one, and it's also the most dynamic. It creates interest in the image as the user tend to anticipate an imminent motion, as in for line to fall very quickly. Now that we have seen different kinds of lines and their meanings, we can look at landscape photography and the application. In landscape photography, you usually have horizon as the longest horizontal line. And as we have seen, horizontal line represents the stillness and calmness. So in order to make the photograph interesting, we have to use vertical lines and diagonal lines intentionally in a creative manner to create interest and make the image more dynamic. One of the ways to do it is to use shapes. Now, if we connect three lines or three different points, we get a triangle. Triangle is the most primary of the shapes. There can be a stable triangle or an unstable triangle. Let's take a look in this illustration. What is the difference between the two? This is a stable triangle. A stable triangle has its broadest base facing downward as a horizontal line. Now, to a viewer, it looks like the triangle is a physical object which is resting in a stable position under the force of gravity. This is an unstable triangle. It is an upward triangle resting on one of its top corner. An unstable triangle makes the image more interesting because it gives a sense of upcoming motion. It lets the viewer anticipate that there's something going to happen. An unstable triangle doesn't need to be three lines connecting and forming a triangle. It can be an apparent shape, which means there can be a directional element, someone's gauge, or another element that points in a direction. Three such elements forming an apparent triangle will also do the trick. Let me show you an example how I tried to create an unstable triangle and how it made the image more interesting in this example. In this image, you can see that the natural structures are forming stable triangles. The mountains, the tent are forming a stable triangle. Now, I tried to include this rock in the front of the image so that apparent lines joining this rock to the tent and the bags and other rocks forms an unstable triangle. You can see that this makes the image more interesting as compared to the other one where I have not done so. Alright, so in this video we have learned how ultra-wide angle lenses provide a huge field of view and a very unique perspective. How we can use composition elements to make the images more interesting. How texture and patterns can be used to add depth to your images. And how dynamic balance can be created by using lines and shapes. Now I really enjoyed using Samyang 14mm f2.8 lens. I enjoyed the wide angle of view that this lens provides. The lens is perfectly sharp and creates good contrast. That is more than anyone expects from a good, high quality, high resolution lens. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and learned something from it. Let me know in the comment section what you think about this video, and if you would like me to make more videos in the future, let me know the topics that you would like me to cover.